Hello, and welcome to the second video of this channel. Today, I'm going to be going on a mission to Duna, but I'm only going to be showing the first half of that mission in this video. We're going to be going from Kerbin to low Duna orbit. Now, the vehicle that we're going to be using to get there is affectionately called Test, and here it is. It is very big. It incorporates the largest stock tank that KSP has to offer and uses down there 21 vector engines, and you can see them all. This is a far bit larger than the vehicle I showed off in the previous video, but the reason for that is the amount of payload that it needs to push into orbit. If we want to go to Duna, we need a fairly large spacecraft. And the size of that spacecraft needs to get even bigger if you want to take 19 Kerbals to Duna, which is what this spacecraft is going to do. In career mode, there's always a million of those contracts that ask tourists to go on various missions to the Moon and Minmus and Duna. And if you can do it all in one mission, if you can even rack up 4 or 5 of those missions all at once, the payoff is extreme and might actually make an expensive vehicle like this worth it. But to help with the gains even further, like the previous rocket, this one also can return to Kerbin and land, and so you'll get to see that in this video as well. I'm just doing a few quick changes here before we get going. I'm going to raise up these parachutes so that I can use them on the descent to Duna. I want to get all the help I can because these missions don't typically end with a large surplus of fuel. So I'm raising them out of that little fairing there so that I can deploy them without deploying the fairing, and then have an engineer repack them for the return trip and subsequent re-entry on Kerbin. The spacecraft that the booster is going to be dropping off in orbit is composed of 3 stages and weighs about 130 tons. The first stage here is going to be used to kick us to Duna and perform the capture maneuver once we get to Duna. The second stage, which you can see at the bottom of the screen now, is for landing and is equipped with one of those Wolfhound engines that I mentioned in the previous video. You can also see the landing legs there. Above that you can see the heat shield and the cabin space, and then above that is the command pod. Now, on the sides of the cabin space you can see a few of those radial engines, and those are going to be used for some of the final maneuvering we need to do, and if we have a fuel margin, a nice soft touchdown, but I wouldn't be too hopeful about that. You can see that I'm loading in a bunch of passengers here, and I do want to test this thing, make sure that it can actually carry 19 Kerbals all the way to Duna. And I actually noticed that I do have a few of those contracts. Now, some of them don't want to go to Duna, but might as well bring some tourists. They should get some fun out of it. Once we get everybody loaded into the spacecraft, it'll be just about time to depart for Duna. An important thing to remember before leaving on any interplanetary journey is to make sure that you've waited for the appropriate transfer window. And in this case, the transfer angle between Kerbin and Duna is about 45 degrees, and we've waited such that Kerbin and Duna are in that position, so we are ready to go. And now we can send this thing out to the launch pad. And here we are on the launch pad and ready to depart for Duna. For the sake of time, I have sped up this portion of the video by 5 times. Now, the thrust-to-weight ratio on this rocket is roughly the same as the thrust-to-weight ratio on the Intrepid 1 at about 1.2. And the reason for that is simply because this is a scaled-up version of that booster, and so the thrust-to-weight ratio and the delta-V are approximately the same for their respective payloads. And the way that I went about choosing a thrust-to-weight ratio of 1.2 is to manage the 2 primary losses that you face on ascent to orbit, those being gravity losses and drag losses. If you're going too fast, you lose a lot of efficiency to drag losses because the drag force increases with the square of your velocity and decreases with decreasing density. So if you go too fast, especially lower in the atmosphere, you will find yourself wasting a lot of fuel pushing through all that atmosphere. Similarly, if you go too slow, you will face a bunch of inefficiencies due to gravity pulling you down, because the longer you spend pointing straight up is all energy wasted to gravity. So 1.2 has a nice little mixture in there. I think it's probably a little on the low side. Most of my rockets that are not SSTOs definitely do have higher thrust-to-weight ratios. I'm not entirely sure if 1.2 is the optimum, but it certainly works for these vehicles. And now we've made it into orbit, and it's time to go ahead and separate the spacecraft. Again, Just like in the previous video, we're going to leave this spacecraft here while we land the main booster, and then we can come back and get ready to depart. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and extend these solar panels so that it doesn't die while it's up here. Although I don't expect that to be a big problem, considering we do have a pilot on board and the batteries are more than capable. And now we can switch back to the main booster, and you can see that the remaining fuel is concentrated in these bottom few tanks. That is to make sure that the CG is there down at the bottom. And I did mention that in the previous video, but the reason for this is the stability of the rocket on descent. It's very important that the engines are pointed down when you're returning, and to make sure that that's the case, it needs to be aerodynamically stable in that orientation. And the way that something is aerodynamically stable, which I'm sure all of you know, is that the center of area is aft of the center of gravity. The center of gravity will lead the way. And so, to make sure that the engines are leading the way, I've made the CG very close to the bottom and left a lot of empty space up near the top. So this will essentially make it act as a wind vane and keep it pointed the direction that I want. This is also aided by the air brakes, which will increase the drag near the nose end of the rocket, pulling it back. And with that in mind, we can begin the process of re-entry and landing. And we have coasted around here so that we are coming up on the Kerbal Space Center. And if you recall in the last video, one of the steps in this process was to lower the thrust on the engines so that the thrust-to-weight ratio was more manageable for landing. However, on this rocket there are 21 engines, and as far as I know, you cannot configure a hotkey to lower the thrust limiter on an engine. So instead, I've got a hotkey set up to disable all but the inside 9 engines, which should reduce the thrust by a little over half. Now, before I do the burn, the retrograde burn, I do want to make sure that the spacecraft, which you can see there eclipsing the stars, is out of the way. It is definitely possible, and it has happened to me many times, that I've done something like this, done my burn like you've seen just there, and then impacted the spacecraft, which I jettisoned earlier. And that is the absolute worst feeling. So I'm just going to nudge my way past the spacecraft there and make sure that I don't break any components on it. With that out of the way, we can begin lowering our periapsis until the point where our orbit intersects the surface of Kerbin is touching just about there at the landmass off to the east of the Kerbal Space Center. You can see there the spacecraft in pink and the inner stage in white moving off to the distance because we have slowed down about 100 meters per second relative to them in order to re-enter. If you remember, this trajectory is the same trajectory as the one I used in the previous video to land the Intrepid 1 near the Kerbal Space Center. There very well may be a better way to do this, but this is the one that has worked for me. Now that we are in the atmosphere, I can go ahead and extend the air brakes, and you can see there's 3 rows of 8 air brakes, and this makes for a total of 24, and we've got 21 vector engines on the bottom. And it's really these components that rack up the price on this booster. Having so many of them makes things increase quite quickly, especially considering that the vector engines are among the most expensive engines of the game because, well, naturally because they have some of the best performance. The reason for the increased number in both of these is just simply the increased mass of this booster. It needs a lot of drag to be able to slow down in a similar way as the Intrepid 1. And if you recall, the Intrepid 1 was moving at about 200 meters per second right before landing burn. Even with all of these drag fins, this booster is going to be moving faster than that at about 250 meters per second. So that is going to make for a slightly more difficult landing, which is all the more terrifying because of the increased stakes with this vastly more expensive booster. You can see there that the plasma has started to form on the leading edge of this booster, so we are getting into the thick of things, and you can see the mountains coming over the horizon, so we are well on our way, getting very close now. Looking at the trajectory, it does look like I've got the opposite problem as last time. It looks like I'm going to overshoot the Kerbal Space Center, but I do have a surplus of delta V, so I'm going to make a few adjustments. I'm going to burn some to help shorten the trajectory. This will also help to make sure that things stay a little cool. With all these components, it's especially stressful when the heat meters start turning on, because usually when one thing goes, they all start going. And though this thing could certainly survive losing a few engines, it's not something that I want to play around with. That being said, coming in from low Kerbin orbit is just about the best case scenario when dealing with re-entry heating, though I have lowered the periapsis more than a simple dip, so the speeds are slightly greater. Usually though, if I'm dealing with some close calls when it comes to these temperature meters, I can pulse the air brakes. I can bring them in and push them back out, or I can rotate the craft. Both of these things help to moderate the temperature. I don't know if that is realistic or if it is simply a limitation of the game, but in either case it does help. Another interesting thing to note here as we begin coming over these mountains and get ready to burn some to help us land is there is a discrepancy between the Delta V calculator that was released in the recent update and the one that you can see in the top left HUD of Kerbal Engineer. Kerbal Engineer is showing about 700 meters per second, and the in-game Delta V calculator is showing about 500. So I don't exactly know which one is more accurate, but I certainly hope it is the Kerbal Engineer. And you saw just there a piece of the burn. I was burning at other times, and I'm burning again now, but I wanted to get a nice side view showing the exhaust coming through. We've made it over the mountains, and you can see the Kerbal Space Center below us. We are coming down nicely, and with this little bit of thrusting, it's looking like we are going to make a beautiful landing. Unlike the landing of the Intrepid 1, we are lined up perfectly, and this is thanks to a nice launch that was nice and roughly zero inclination, so when we came back around there was no north or south offset. And here we go, we are coming down. We are going to land just before the water, and you can see that our speed is getting slower, but very slowly. Despite the increased speed over the Intrepid 1, we are going to try to maintain roughly the same landing profile as the previous video. That means we're going to start the landing burn at about 1,000 meters above the surface and then whittle the speed down slowly until we're on the ground. And there we go, we've started the landing burn. Going to keep getting slower. Once the vehicle is almost straight up, we're going to activate radial out and enable RCS to help keep it upright, especially once it's on the ground. And there it is, a nice gentle touchdown. You can see the RCS on top trying desperately to keep the booster from falling over. It is lucky that we had a bit of a fuel margin because those RCS thrusters do use the fuel in the boosters. And it has happened to me before where you land with nearly zero and then those cut out and the booster falls over. But we can now recover the vessel and get the monetary gains. These are going to be dramatic, especially considering we are at the Kerbal Space Center and that the initial cost of the booster was extremely high. Same as last time, there was no science done on this mission, but there will be meaningful science next time. And here we've got 98% value and 613,000 funds recovered from the booster. I may have misspoken earlier by saying that the booster was about 800,000. That was including the cost of the spacecraft, which is also filled with many components and very expensive. That being said, there's not going to be too many payloads greater than 120 tons that are cheap. So, with the booster landed and the funds recovered, we can return to our spacecraft that we left in orbit and get ready to take it to Duna with Valentina and her 18 friends. However, I think this video has gone on just about long enough, so I'm going to delay showing that part of this mission until the next video. I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if you have any questions or recommendations, please leave them in the comments. I will try my very best to answer all of them. And again, I don't think that's going to be a challenge at this phase in the channel. Hopefully one day it might actually be a struggle. But considering I expect none of you to comment, I think I'm going to be fine. Again, thanks, and I will see you next time.